and one that I have to say you administered with verve. But it has, I think, materially changed the way everybody in the museum thinks. I mean, I think you probably find it very testing that the scripts had to go backwards and forwards, so that when we had eventually spiced them up and said that this was the greatest scene of male-female violence in Central America in 5 millennia or whatever it was you wanted.
Very vulgar.
For promotional purposes, exactly. And could we have an expert on SM practices as one of the outside contributors? It will change our future exhibition policy, there's no doubt. Very seriously, you must have found it infuriating to the text all go back, and then us having said, we just can't say that. I'm sorry, we simply can't say that. We don't know, or whatever. And particularly, we don't know, that we can't say this because the evidence just is not strong enough, whatever. You, I know, eventually kind of settled down to the fact that this impossible straitjacket of integrity had to be borne as imposed by these scholars. But for us, it did, I think, raise a kind of question that we'd never had before, of really how interesting can you make this? And because, like all academics, of course, the people working in museums, they've chosen the subject, they know why it's important, they live with the things, they know the things. To be asked to explain to a totally uninformed and until then uninterested public why this object matters, why it should be preserved in a public institution, studied at public expense, and then displayed or written about. I mean, that was really a very energizing experience.
Absolutely.
And I think it's fair to say, I mean, every curator in the museum was involved in this project, over 100 eventually. And I think every one of them would say that they now think differently about the relationship between their object and the public. So it was very stressful for you, I think, but it has very definitely changed the way the curators think about presenting the material to the public.
And I think it's changed the way the way we think about how this kind of material can be presented. I think our favourite moments were sometimes several weeks after a programme had been finished. A curator would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and remember that there's a tiny factual error embedded in the programme, and it would have to be changed, and was changed. But it was a very happy process, and I think important to all of us was the concept at the heart of it was a public service partnership, two distinguished public sector organisations working together and making the programmes, whatever the other commercial spin-offs, the book and so on, but making all of this material available as widely as possible.
I think that's been it couldn't have happened without that. I mean, it required, I think, two institutions that are publicly funded and belong in a very real sense to the public, and in which the public have rights, and which has been the basis for both institutions from the beginning. So I think the fact that there was no commercial dimension to it at all took a huge strain off it. I don't think it could have happened otherwise if from the beginning we'd been squabbling about how much each had to pay for what service or who got what benefit. I think the necessary disagreements and difficulties about form and format and tone would have been unbearable. And one of the big developments that comes out of that, I think it extends the possibility of wider public benefit because of what's happened to sound technology. Again, speaking from our point of view, this engagement of how to present, no one had ever, I think, thought, how do you introduce a great collection orally? But, of course, that is now quite clearly how most of our visitors are going to experience the collection. I think it's fairly clear within 5 years, museums will not have labels. Everybody will have their iPhone or whatever. And everybody will have the information, if they want it, in great depth about objects on show in several languages, in a way that's never been possible before. as it happened, this project coincided with that great technological shift. And it has, I think, raised questions for museums all around the world. How do you actually present your collection through the spoken word, which is clearly going to be, I think, the dominant form of communication now. And radio is right at the heart of that.
We'll take some questions in a moment. I just want to play one more clip before we do that. As you saw at the beginning, the partnership has developed, and recently, in fact, it just finished last Friday, the latest series as part of the BBC for Olympics year, Cultural Olympics, the BBC Shakespeare season. Neil and the team produced a series called Shakespeare's Restless World. We deliberately didn't call it Shakespeare in 20 objects to make the difference, and in fact I think there were all sorts of objects in it. But again, it was trying to use similar techniques and objects as the starting point for history and for storytelling, to look at Shakespeare in a different way, and to look at Shakespeare, the material culture around Shakespeare and Shakespeare's world. And we've just got I think we're going to hear the eye relic.
Looking at this silver box, I find myself haunted by the thought of the last thing that Edward Eldcorn saw with this right eye. He had been hanged and cut down while still alive. So his last sight was almost certainly of a crowd of men and women pushing and shoving, trying to get a better view. And then finally, the hangman approaching with his knife to disembowel him. All we can hope is that he was still confident that one man's courage can change the world. And that's what we'll be discussing in our next and final programme.
We've chosen all the gory bits for this morning. Just very final question from me. I mean, the history of the world, Shakespeare's Restless World, they exist. They're all still available as downloads. They're on the website. The images are all there. But of course, there is now also very successful a book, which has been published here, and as I mentioned, has been translated, and I think is now available quite widely. I saw it in Germany when I was at the Leipzig conference at the Hauptbahnhof in Leipzig. There it was, the German. I was very pleased. I went to look for it, and it was there, the German edition. What is the legacy? Is it? I mean, this began as a radio series. Many people are going to come at it through the book. Do you think, in the end, inevitably, the book, the written form, takes over, because that is an object you can have?
I think this is one of the things that has changed again dramatically in the last 5 years. I'm sure if we'd done this 20 years ago, that would have been the case, because the programs would have been broadcast and then lost, and the book would have lasted. What is remarkable, of course, is because of the download, and the fact that the downloads, and the great generosity of the BBC in making the downloads freely available in perpetuity. I mean, the fact that people are still downloading them means that the sound survives in a quite new way. And again, because of working with the BBC, it's taken us into the World Network and the World Service and whatever. I'm very struck all around the world by people all over the place who download them and have them, and that's what they're responding to. So I think the legacy of this kind of partnership, and I think this is a partnership that really, I feel this, one of the legacies I hope will be that broadcasting companies, broadcasting corporations around the world, working with their great collections, can actually do this again. There's no reason why it seems to me this shouldn't be infinitely replicated as a way of really allowing the public to own their collections. And certainly in all European countries, we have very similar models of public collections and public broadcasters. And I hope the legacy will be that this will happen again. From the more specific case, there's been a great interest in the idea of exhibitions of trying to present a history of the world through things. Through 100 things, we've been asked to present this in several places around the world. Or indeed, other things, like we've been asked, would we do a history of the Middle East in 100 objects? And that, I think, goes back to the very place we began about this kind of history, that the great advantage of this kind of history is it allows different readings of societal change. It frees you from the tyranny of a battle or a king, and lets you talk about much bigger ideas, and it is infinitely replicable. So I think that's going to be quite a major legacy in terms of exhibitions, as well as the book. But above all, I think the marvelous thing now is that the broadcast sound can live, and clearly will go on doing, as long as it's made freely available.
We've no plans to stop it. We've got a bit of time for any questions. There are a couple of audience microphones. If you'd like to put your hand up, yes, so at the back there. Just wait for the microphone. Yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I was just wondering, we've talked a lot about how, as programme makers, we gain a lot from academics, and how it's opening up to an audience that maybe wouldn't experience this kind of academia otherwise. And I was wondering whether the relationship goes in the other way, and whether academics, have you sensed a change in the academic field that people are thinking about different kinds of questions from perhaps a more emotional perspective and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. I think why I think this came at such a good moment is precisely because academic inquiry is changing so much more into these other areas of human response. The attempt by academics to write histories of love, histories of intimacy, whatever, and understanding that these are essential kinds of histories if we're going to make sense of our own story. This is very, very good for radio. It's not just the great oral histories of the sort that we all know. It actually allows different scholarly inquiry of events past and contemporary. So yes, I think it is encouraging that kind of historical investigation very, very seriously.
Kari, we'll just bring a microphone to you, Kari.
And someone else
just here on the fourth row here. Thank you.
I just wondered, how did you choose the objects?
Well, this was the greatest fun of the lot, of course. The rule of the game was that we would try to go from the beginning of human creativity, so about 2 million years ago in Africa, right up to today, and we'd keep going around the world. So we'd keep saying, choose, as it were, around 200 BC, around 400 AD, whatever, and spin the globe and choose something from, as far as possible, all the continents. And that meant putting together curators and scholars who'd never, of course, thought about their collections in this way. And when you talked about what scholars have got from it, it's not just the tone of their address, but you can imagine that if you're an Egyptologist and you spent your life in ancient Egypt, it has never occurred to you to think whether there's an object in your collection that might speak somehow to an object from China and Mexico at the same date, even though there's no connection other than what it is that people feel and worry about and hope for or whatever at that moment. So to go back to that earlier question, it asks different questions of the same objects. And we found we could ask things that if you wanted to talk about as a fear of death or the idea of the king, to look at the collections, seeing if we could find objects that would let us ask the same sort of question in completely separate societies. Later on, it became easier because you would choose objects that were where they had travelled from one bit of the world to another or whatever, where we knew there were contacts. But particularly in that early period, it forced us into these ideas of what are the human universals, what does every society need to think about, and what's the Mexican example and what's the Egyptian one. So every week, because we did them in clutches of fives, we got the curators and chose 5 objects from a particular moment that spoke to each other. And that, you can imagine, that's why it's changed the way they think about their collection, of course.
Did they get competitive about wanting that?
Very. It was terrific competition, of course, as you can imagine. And the Chinese curators completely bewildered that any other country should be part of this series at all. And then the Egyptians insisting that they were, of course, much older than China as a culture. And well, you can imagine. And also, what it did, I think, bring out, again, in a way that I think none of us had really thought about, is, of course, the inequity, the injustice of what happens to survive. So that, for instance, there's virtually no Aboriginal Australian material culture that has survived, other than stone tools, from before about 1800. So you simply can't tell that story in the same way. And those necessary injustices of history became very, very clear. So it was good.
Yes, please.
I hope I can articulate this. In America, there's a movement away from object creation and more interactivity and, experience kind of creation. And I'm wondering, in the arts and the humanities and in public radio, I'm wondering how do you document your history then, when it's all about experience and interactivity? What will that say about us historically?
It is very difficult to document. One of the real problems, as you know at the moment, is how on earth the libraries collect websites and what states. So, it is going to be a real problem to document. Maybe, but actually, I think what will we'll have to. It'll only be done orally from now, I think. And I think it will recognise that large parts of human activity have never been documentable or recoverable, and particularly the interactive bits. It's very interesting, when we were doing the Shakespeare programmes, we had lots of physical objects with which we could demonstrate how the Shakespeareans ate and what about food in Shakespeare. There's very little physical evidence of sex among Elizabethans that survives, obviously. Other than us, but the supreme human interactive experience is essentially undocumented.
There were at least a couple. I'm going to go to the lady over there first.
2 questions. I wondered what you started thinking about when you're doing history through objects versus ceremony and song, and what your thought process was around that. And then also when you mentioned the changing of labels, in museums into something that you'll download and there won't be a written label, and how you think about that with what you do.
I think what is, I think, really different about taking an object history is you have an object biography. So you escape from the maker. And most of our object conversations, because they're mostly dominated by art, are about the artist and the construction we've made of this unique and anguished persona or whatever. The object takes you out of that into something much wider. But above all, the object takes you through time. And an object history, ceremony can't do that, dance can't do that, music can't do that in nearly the same way. An object that has been transmitted, valued, lost, recovered, reinterpreted over 2,000 years gives you many different stories of different societies and different places. So objects open far more doors than any of the others, I think. And the opportunity that the new technology offers is, I think, limitless. For the first time, it will mean that you can actually hear the story of the object in your own language. And also look at it in detail if that's what's required, if it's fragile. It completely transforms the way the viewer and the thing can engage in a public collection. And we're just at the threshold of that.
Gentleman towards the back now.
I just wanted to ask, Did the original impetus come from, where the original impetus came from? Was it from the museum or was it from Radio 4?
Well,
and when did it become clear that it was going to be such a large project?
The lovely thing about it, no one can now remember whose idea it was. We'd begun talking quite a lot about focusing on things and short programs on things. We'd done a couple of individual one-off programs. And then the thought was, should we perhaps try to do 5 or 10 on, as it were, the Renaissance or whatever. And then through a process that I think largely involved Jane Ellison and Joanna Mackle and Rob, it grew into this. And then the BBC, with, I think, extraordinary courage, decided it was going to run 100 programs and commit from the beginning to the whole 100. I was very frightened about this. If after 5 programs it became clear that the public didn't want any, the idea of going on churning out another 95 filled me with dread. But it was a very brave decision of the BBC to do that. And that was taken, I think, very much, Rob will correct me, but I think that was very much Mark Damazo's...
Mark Damazo, who was then the controller of Radio 4. They were also, each programme was broadcast 3 times a day. And I think after the first one went out, there was a nervous moment where, as Neil says, we thought, well, there's 99 more of these scheduled to go out 3 times a day. We hope it works, but in terms of the origins, that's right. There was an existing relationship between some of the documentaries team and the museum, and we had been doing some, on a much smaller scale, some object-centred programs, and I think it grew out of that, and it grew out of Mark Damazer, the controller of Radio 4, wanting to put some much bigger historical series onto the radio, and that was really what catalysed it.
I think it's perhaps just worth saying that in that context, but also in terms of the legacy, one of the great advantages of the partnership and the great generosity of the BBC was in bringing BBC Nations and Regions into the project right at the beginning, so that across the whole of the UK, local museums worked with their local BBC radio stations. And those networks established, those relations have in some cases been completely transformational. I know, for instance, in the northeast, in the Newcastle area, the relationship has been completely transformed, and there is now a regular set of connections and exchanges. And I think that's actually very important. That it's worked for museums of all sorts across the country.
We've got time for at least one more, if there is. Gentleman over there.
It might be slightly simplistic, but was there a temptation to move towards objects which themselves made a sound or had a sound?
Sorry?
Objects which themselves had a sound or had a sonic value?
Absolutely. There was. We decided we would try to keep off subjects that were texts. I think the Rosetta Stone was the only exception to that. So we wanted things. And of course, we wanted ideally things that would make a noise. The problem is that most of the things in the museum that once made a noise have broken and don't any longer. Or if they do, they're so fragile and would break if we now made the noise. So we chose, for instance, a Chinese bell, a bronze bell, which we took as an emblem of Confucian harmony and the Chinese notion of harmony rather than debate. We were eventually allowed to strike that after long discussions with the conservators and a carefully muffled gong. We were allowed to bang it. We had a wooden drum from Congo in the middle of the 19th century that had been taken as part of the slave trade and then the British occupation of Sudan, so it told lots of stories. It was decided we couldn't bang or it might break, but one like it, as it were, one prepared before, was used. So we did try, but it became complicated. But we managed in the Shakespeare to find a clock made by a Huguenot immigrant, and that played all kinds of pleasingly Shakespearean music. So it helps, obviously.
Okay. Thank you all very much, and most of all, thank you very much to Neil MacGregor for coming and talking to us.
For a fantastic, fascinating hour. We're all back to the day job in an hour. You've got lunch for an hour, and then we go into our groups for the next set of group discussions for the two programs that we heard before Neil's wonderful presentation. So you've got an hour for lunch. We reassemble at 2.